Okay, I just want to use this video to do a quick kind of wrap up over the Black Death by looking at the effects of the Black Death. And we can differentiate and categorize these as both as short-term and long-term effects. When we're talking about short-term effects, these would be effects, events, characteristics, phenomenon, whatever you want to call them, but these would be occurring in the immediate aftermath of the Black Death. So within, I'd say, the first year or two. Whereas long-term effects would take longer to develop and get going, but they'd also be they'd also have a much longer impact on medieval society. So we'll start by looking at the short-term effects. So perhaps the most obvious and also the starkest short-term effect of the time would be the population loss. Roughly 1/3 of Europe's population died during the Black Death. It's roughly 20 to 25 million people. So a lot of people died from the Black Death. Also, the economy during and for the immediate aftermath of the pandemic totally collapsed, especially trade. And this really does make sense if you think about it. As people kept quarantining and basically shutting themselves away and avoiding interaction to avoid catching the plague, it makes sense how the economic activity would effectively grind to a halt, particularly trade, since trade by definition is taking something from one area and spreading it to another area, and that would include disease. So as people made the correlation or recognized the correlation and the connection between the spread of plague with trade especially totally stopped, but all other forms of economic activity were severely reduced. Third, there was a pretty substantial breakdown of law and order, as Giovanni Boccaccio describes in his source that you should have looked at yesterday. Boccaccio describes how all of the major officials who would have been enforcing law and order were not doing so during the pandemic. They were either quarantining, or they were sick, or they were dead. But either way, there was no one who was bothering to enforce the law because it was generally perceived to be too dangerous to do so. And kind of in keeping with this breakdown of law and order, there was a sharp uptick in acts of violence against outsider groups that were perceived to be, again, outside of mainstream medieval culture, who were typically blamed for major natural disasters and calamities like the spread of bubonic plague. And notably, the main two targets of these acts of violence were Jews and gypsies. So those are the main short-term effects. But if we look at the long-term effects, long-term, we can see how the Black Death really did start really undermining and setting the stage for the fall of feudalism. First major long-term effect, peasants gained power. So long-term, the Black Death was actually pretty beneficial to peasants, mainly because it caused a labor shortage. With the death of 1/3 of Europe's population, and most of those deaths being peasants, a significant part of the medieval workforce died. So those peasants who survived the plague were now all of a sudden way more important and valuable than they had been before. They were much more difficult to replace. If, for example, you had a group of peasants that were trying to push their lord for higher wages or for more benefits, more rights, it would be pretty easy for the lord to just kick them off his land and replace them with more peasants. But after the Black Death, the would-be replacement peasants were dead. So the nobles were even more dependent on the peasants that survived for their labor. And as a result of this, the peasants realized that they could use their newfound importance, to get more rights to increase their standard of living. So because of this massive labor shortage created by the population loss, the remaining peasants were able to use that leverage to get higher wages, more benefits, like or when you say more benefits, like better living conditions, or they were allowed to keep a larger portion of the crop that they grew for their lord. They were able to get more rights and even more economic opportunity, as the guild system that controlled entry into the trades was effectively shattered by the Black Death. Prior to the Black Death, the guild system determined who was allowed to practice the skilled trades, so things like metalworking or carpentry. And the way the guild system worked, all of the master craftsmen in a specific industry, in a specific area, would belong to a guild. So I'll use blacksmith as an example. So if a person wanted to be a blacksmith, they would have to get permission and apprentice to a master blacksmith through their local blacksmith's guild. And this was really difficult to get. The guilds were really selective about who they allowed to become apprentices and who they ultimately allowed to join the guilds. And prior to the Black Death, really the only way a person could get admitted to a guild was if their father was already a member of that guild and could effectively forge the connections they would need and basically lay the groundwork to get them an apprenticeship beforehand. However, because of the Black Death, a lot of these guild members and a lot of people who had connections to guilds died. And this left a massive hole in the trades. There were a lot of positions in these skilled trades that needed to be filled, and the people who normally would fill them were dead. So because there were all these positions that needed filling, the guilds started allowing and opening up membership to people who did not have these familial connections. So all of a sudden, if you were a peasant, it was a lot easier to move into a guild and learn a skilled trade. And by learning and practicing a skilled trade, you'd be able to actually boost your standard of living and have a higher quality of life. So ultimately, the massive population loss and labor shortage caused by that created more job opportunities and better jobs for peasants. It allowed the peasants to use their newfound importance to the nobility to get higher wages and get more benefits from the nobles. So overall, the peasants gained power, or let me rephrase that. The peasants that survived the Black Death gained power long term. The second major long-term effect of the Black Death was the church lost a lot of its authority and legitimacy in the eyes of the people. And this really stemmed from the years that bubonic plague affected Europe during this time. We have been in the coronavirus pandemic has lasted for about 8 or 9 months. The Black Death lasted between 3 to 5 years at least. So because of the incredibly long stretch of time that the plague impacted Europe, and because of the inability of church officials who were claiming to have the ear of God and who were claiming to be the representatives of God on earth and to be the intermediaries between the people and God, because they were unable to stop the plague, the people gradually came to lose respect for the institution of the church, because the church, again, had been claiming that they could convince God to stop the plague, and they didn't. So the people lost a lot of the church lost a lot of its authority and legitimacy. Now, it's important to note that when we're saying the church lost legitimacy, that's not saying that that was the general trend of religiosity in Europe following the Black Death. when we're saying the church lost legitimacy, we're just talking about the institution of the church. There were generally two major and pretty starkly different attitudes toward religion in general following the Black Death. You had one group of people that got more religious after the Black Death because they viewed the plague as a sign of God's wrath and that God was effectively punishing the world for sin, and therefore the only way to correct this was to become even more religious. And then you had another group that generally kind of lost faith in God, or at least lost faith in organized religions because of the plague. They came to view the plague as a sign that God, that at least God, as they were told by the church, was wrong. So you had the two competing reactions. You had some groups that got a lot more religious, and you had a lot of people, and you had some groups that got a lot less religious after the Black Death. But regarding the institution of the church, that by and large lost authority. So these two facts taken together, these two trends taken together, the peasants gaining power and the church losing power, gradually erode the foundations of feudalism and create a situation where feudalism really was kind of on the way, would be on the way out. And it would spend the next roughly 100 years or so gradually weakening over time because of that. So just to explain why, the peasants gaining power, it weakened the authority and the power the nobles wielded over the peasants. And this also made the peasants less dependent on the nobility for their livelihood. So the authority and the prestige of being a noble was somewhat diminished as the peasants were able to somewhat get out from under the power and control of the nobles. Secondly, the loss of legitimacy by the church also helped weaken feudalism because the church was no longer there to provide legitimacy and to deflect criticism from feudalism. Prior to the Black Death, the Catholic Church had been arguing that a person's station in life was God's will. If a person was a peasant, it was because God wanted them to be a peasant, and the church would argue that who was this person to question God? However, with the church losing legitimacy and people starting to question the church more, people, by extension, started to question feudalism more. So as time goes on, you have more and more peasants who start wondering, why am I agreeing to a system where I really do all the work, and yet that guy gets all the benefits of my work? And as this system goes on, as these questions intensify over time, feudalism really does start to weaken, which we'll see later on when we start to look at what I consider to be the nail in the coffin for feudalism, the 100 Years' War after Thanksgiving break. All right, so take care, guys, and I will talk to you later.